So, today between realism and naturalism, Huck Finn. What do we think of when we think Huck Finn? I actually think of just that, which I'm now going to turn myself into. Not that I smoke, but the absolute quiet beauty of not having anything to do or being able to do what you wanted. I keep this fishing rod in my office, as a matter of fact, just to remind me that I could be doing something completely different. And if you ever see me walking towards the Rhine River and the Alsace where fishing is possible, even without an official license, and then with that fishing rod over my shoulder, humming the melody of the early 1970s, the Abenteuer von Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. This is 4-part TV series starring Roland de Mongeau and Marc Di Napoli. Then you know I finally cracked. And I think I should take this pipe out of the it's a bit easier to speak without the pipe. Is it actually possible not to know the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? I mean, I guess you all did. You all? Anybody here who heard Huckleberry Finn for the first time from me? I don't think so. 136 years after its publication, the story of Huck, the fictional tale of his carefully planned escape from his alcoholic and abusive father, his adventurous journey down the Mississippi with the escapee slave Jim, should of rights be part of the UN World Cultural Heritage, pun intended. However, a lot of strange things happened with this text from the start and continue to happen in recent years. Most of that has to do with the fact that the book was written in Stephen Crane's times and that it shares moments of romanticism and the larger quantity of literary realism with an often overlooked share of naturalism and even some early modernist features. In sum total, this creates a book that already in its own days was located on the dissident fringe, disquieting and even shocking many readers who had so far thought of Twain just as an occasionally somewhat garrulous humorist. That there was more, and that this more was darker, should have been apparent from the memoir Life on the Mississippi that had come onto the book market in 1883. I can't go into too much detail here. As a consequence, just about every one of the groups which so far had either liked or disliked Twain made Huck Finn the object of their more or less racist and always self-righteous attacks, depending on whether they were progressives or reactionaries, or belonged with the more fringe groups of fanatics, religious or political, or both. And like that, it remained throughout the book's publication history. There are, for instance, again, attempts at banning and censoring Twain's novel. Insofar as, most recently, some well-intentioned but lamentably ignorant people have accused Twain, somewhat predictably, of racism in his depiction of Nigger Jim and want the book thrown out of libraries and curricula. Just briefly, I'll get back to that in more detail. Twain never calls Jim Nigger Jim in the book. Ernest Hemingway did that. And I'll get back to him in a minute. And two, there's no other book in American literature written by a white person in the second half of the 19th century that treats an African-American character with as much respect and assigns as much dignity to him as the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And that even though the narrative perspective is that of Huck, a roughly 12 to 14-year-old boy who has grown up in the racist slaveholding South, swallowing along the way most of the racist ideologies that were used by the ruling class to keep poor whites and similarly poor African Americans apart, to keep them from realizing their common plight and turning against their oppressors. That some of these ideologies are still operational is observable to this day, or otherwise a movement like Black Lives Matter would not exist. To Twain, the black life of his Jim figure mattered very much, and even though he himself had, like his fictional figure Huck, grown up in and with the real life, normal racism of his days, he dared to show Jim and Huck as equals, time and again. Like here, equals in relaxation, and in other situations they're equally scared, aided by the famous illustrator E.W. Campbell, whose illustrations I'll freely use throughout here. Note also the paternal way in which Jim here has his arms around both Huck and Tom. In this, Campbell even goes beyond that which Twain had written in the text, showing a fatherly Jim for both boys, which can be read as symbolic of the status that black-white relations were supposed to have reached by the time the novel was published in 1885. Only that the end of the Reconstruction period 10 years earlier had signaled the restitution of the Southern aristocracy to its pre-war power. And by 1885, Henry James could have a Southern War veteran, Basil Ransom, his name, muse in his Bostonians whether or not a system closer to chattel slavery might actually be more beneficial for as a labor form of organization, given the destitution and poverty of industrial workers in the North. Whereas authors like Thomas Nelson Page and Joel Chandler Harris and other Southern racist fiction writers of the time made sure that pity for the defeated masters rather than sympathy for the plight of their slaves became the popular order of the literary day. Twain's story of the two fugitives from Southern white society, one an outclass white boy, the other a fugitive slave, and especially their interaction and realization of each other's humanity, was an important voice in that context. Its tone made sure that it might at least initially be read as an extended Uncle Remus tale of a white boy plus an older, avuncular African-American male, if readers were looking for this kind of humorous story. But Huck Finn was far more centrally a highly ironic satire of American and especially Southern society with its conceits, its anachronistic idea of honor, and its continuing treatment of African Americans as second-class humans. In its attention to geographic, social, and linguistic detail, it shared more than the year of its first appearance on the literary scene with William Dean Howells's exemplary novel of literary realism, The Rise of Silas Lapham. The same year, however, also saw the first publication of Émile Zola's Germinal and Henry Rider Haggard's daring adventure novel King Solomon's Mines. Huckleberry Finn, as a story of daring escapes and switched identities, also contained a lot of adventure, as promised in the title, as well as a less rambunctious element of naturalism in its depiction of the main hero as somebody whose level of education and growth might be predetermined by his heritage after all. I'll get back to that. The book has been in print continuously, translated into most of the language for which there are printed versions, and even into some where there aren't, like Alemanian. A friend of mine did that. There are numerous adaptations, classics illustrated, of course, and a cartoon film, the 1971 Hal Overton opera, and several films, the most famous one probably still the 1939 version with a young Mickey Rooney as Huck. And in 2010 or so, the video which I mentioned earlier, this French, Italian, German mini-series finally appeared as a DVD. And then there's the early 90s attempt by Stephen Sommers to adapt Huck Finn to the present. And you can see in it how Elijah Wood, even then, already could look mostly like this sort of, like somebody just stepped on his foot. The expression on his face that he has all the time as the Hobbit. The book, first, from the assorted attempts at adaptations, we can also see that there's something strange going on with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Whereas Tom Sawyer is usually adapted almost one-on-one, Huck Finn tends to get butchered and rearranged and made out to be much nicer and less racist and less cruel, focusing on the adventurous fun. There seems to be an idea ingrained in publishers and the general readership's heads that because it was called Tom Sawyer's Comrade, you can read that here. If you can read it, is that visible from the back? Yeah? Okay. Tom Sawyer's Comrade, it must be a book for juveniles or even kids, which it isn't. True, Twain was fully intending to write a sequel to the hugely successful Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but then he didn't. Only the first 5 chapters follow the style and tone of the first book, and even here there are already some strange undertones. Tom Sawyer had been a genial parody of the well-established genre of the boys' book, whereas the run-of-the-mill educational tracts meted out by various religious groups and the rags-to-riches boys' books of the eponymous Horatio Alger came with a hefty load of Calvinist self-denial, strict disciplines, Jeffersonian honesty, and Franklinist thrift. Tom Sawyer had none of it, nor wanted any. Prankish, Tom captured the hearts and minds of generations, together with his pre-adolescent love interest Becky Thatcher, his trusty sidekicks, the less mischievous Joe Harper, and ragged and pragmatic Huck Finn. That's what he looks like in the Tom Sawyer book. The son of the village drunk. Tom Sawyer firmly cemented Twain's reputation as the leading humorist American writer of the West. Small wonder then that Twain would try to cash in on his success with what was already a typical feature in the 1870s book market, a sequel. After all, there was a strong demand, so strong that in fact he had form letters printed to reply to the many individuals writing to him about a continuation of the Tom Sawyer adventures. But he went from the perspective of an omniscient middle-class narrator looking benevolently at a somewhat overly imaginative boy's life to the perspective of unschooled, outclass Huck. And this is where the troubles start. It's true that the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn accomplished something even linguistically that had not been done before in this extended form. It led the 12 to 14-year-old rover in the tradition of the Spanish pícaro talk in his native jargon and in first person, quite literally giving voice to the American vernacular. Pairing this boy off with an African-American and an escaped slave at that, in a setting and a slide and a time frame depicting the last years before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the book forced its readers into a position that not only viewed the geographical Mississippi Valley across the years, like a locus amoenus from the past, but also revisited the social and political Mississippi through a glass darkly, with the not quite finished Civil War situated between the then and the now. Thus cited as a crossroads of several discourses, Huck Finn was, from the start, going to be the one of Samuel Clemens's novels that was to have the most lasting effect. It would draw most critical attention, raise most controversies, and see the most substantial shifts in critical responses. One of the strangest, yet most intriguing comments came from an author whose own influence on American fiction cannot be overestimated. Ernest Hemingway, I mentioned him before. And I would like to look at this in more detail, since in a nutshell it can serve to explain a lot of what went wrong with the reception of Huck Finn in the past. He wrote in The Green Hills of Africa, "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. If you read it, you must stop where the nigger Jim is stolen from the boys." This is where the nigger Jim comes from. That is the real end. The rest is just cheating. But it's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, there's been nothing as good since. I mean, that's a statement, huh? Hemingway's problem with the text starts already where the nigger Jim is stolen from the boys, because neither is Jim ever called that, nor is there such a moment in the book. Tom is a presence throughout the book, insofar as he is there at the beginning and again at the end. And several of Huck's ingenious plans and solutions to problems encountered along the way are made and conceived in the spirit of what Tom would have done. He says that several times. However, the companion of the title he is not. For most part, and for the important chapters set on the raft going down the Mississippi, Huck is paired off with just Jim, the escaped slave whom he knows from the widow Douglas's household, belonging to her spinster sister, Miss Watson. When the older one of the two scoundrels calling themselves the King and the Duke, who hitch a somewhat involuntary ride on the raft with Huck and Jim, eventually sells Jim into captivity and to make a measly $40 to get drunk on, Tom is nowhere near. Twain brings him back only in the next chapter, in a move that, as far as I'm concerned, indicates he might have planned to have the book end on a similarly light-hearted note as the beginning, as it started, with pranks. If that was the case, it worked only as long as enough readers thought that black lives didn't matter. In order to understand this problem better, I need to include a closer reading of the whole text. So far, I've mentioned the first and the last part of this book, but there are arguably four main sections. The chapter set in St. Petersburg, with the times that Huck spends at the widow Douglas's house, with Tom Sawyer's gang and with his father. Secondly, the flight from the cabin where his father had locked him up, meeting Jim on Jackson Island and their initial journey down the river, including the Sir Walter Scott episode and the fog in which they miss the junction with the Ohio. Then the following episodes of the third section have less of Huck and Jim in them, but rather depict a kaleidoscope of Southern life, feuding families and villages ruled by colonels, con men on the prowl, and their more or less helpless victims in the Wilkes family chapters. Finally, in the Phelps farm chapters, Huck and Jim are sort of reunited, if it wasn't for Tom keeping them apart. Already in the first section of the book, attentive readers could find two new elements. As I said, this looks like, but there are some sort of incremental variations. For one, after the hilarious experience with the Arab caravan that turns out to be a Sunday school picnic, Huck gets quite literally disenchanted with Tom's second-hand imaginative spells, which Huck now simply calls lies. And this is the last we see of Tom until the fourth part. Instead, the reader gets a closer look at the figure of Jim, Jim is depicted as superstitious, but so, if not more so, is Huck. As I said, they're treated as equals. One of the premises on which they will meet, exchange, and discourse throughout the novel in some of the funniest passages of the book. They also share a similar readiness to be economical and pragmatic in their dealings with the rest of the world. There's a logic in them fleeing together, too, in that second part, from Huck's abusive father and from slavery, respectively, in what arguably can be read as America's first great road movie, with the slight modification that the road's actually underwater, 2 fathoms deep, so to speak. Mark Twain. And you know that Mark Twain was the sign for 2 fathoms of water, which was actually enough for any boat to cross over a sandbar or whatever it was. That's where Mark Twain comes from. There are a handful of idyllic and serenely beautiful moments on that river, none more sublimely magnificent than the famous beginning of chapter 19, before the arrival of the king and the duke. And these passages, which are still reverberating in the public imagination and that have inspired the imagery of the movies, the book and the story looks like this cover here of the Bantam Classics edition. That's as romantic as it gets. This romantic imagery is linked to the realism and the naturalism of the 3rd and 4th sections of the book, mainly through the figure of Huck, since he covers much of the idea of the feral child growing up seemingly without the fetters of civilization and speaking what romantics would have called natural language. Both impressions, I would claim, are somewhat misleading. As Twain himself pointed out, he tried as faithfully as he could to replicate the distinctive sounds of Pike County, the extreme southwest, and of Jim's Missouri variant of African-American English. This is, however, not just realism, this is actually naturalism as far as speech is concerned. Huck is featured not so much as a romantic child, but as a non-standard speaker who has been unhappily imbued with the moral and political standards of the society around him, and who has acquired the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetics to the extent to which he and Twain needs them in the course of the novel, for instance, in the altercation with his father. Now here, Huck looks more like Tom usually does in the book. And this is as close as he gets to him, becoming civilized and able to read and write. When abducted by old man Finn, however, he slips back into this feral state, a typical motif in naturalist novels. Huck's perspective is thus simultaneously that of the famous sound, hard, and deformed conscience, as Twain himself formulated it in one of his notebooks. He's also not exactly what Kenneth Lynn claimed when he calls Huck's actions vernacular honesty. This is a very optimist idea of Huck, typical 1950s, 60s. Tenable only as long as and if the focus is limited to Huck's attitude towards the reader. To the readers, he is actually constantly and continuously honest. However, already in his contact with Jim, and with just about everybody else they encounter along the route, Huck is anything but honest. In fact, he's maybe not an inveterate liar in the morally negative sense, like the Duke and the King. And there are significant qualitative differences also by comparison. But there's an almost endless sequence of narratives and practical fakes strung out from the home of the widow Douglas and her sister via Jackson Island and the Loftus farm all the way to Louisiana. At the Loftus farm, he's even dressed up as a girl. Here being dressed up by Jim and then appearing on the doorstep. The pattern is nearly always the same. Huck tries to pass himself off as somebody else. In the case of his encounter with the farmer's wife, Judith Loftus, here even as a girl. His cover is rejected by the people he talks to. But in the next step, Huck's antagonists usually convince themselves, rather than he doing that, of another version of who or what Huck actually might be, or what might be happening, or might have happened. Eagerly supported by Huck, who helps negotiating a new tale that is equally, if not further away from the truth. The big difference between Huck's renegotiations of truth and Tom's fantastic plots, both at the beginning of the book as well as in his personal version of a prisoner's escape melodrama towards the end, is just that. Huck's tales conform to tactical lines provided by the situation and by his antagonists. When he's about to tell on Jim and encounters the two slave hunters, after the initial lie about the man on the raft being white, he just follows the leads the two men provide, the two men in the skiff, convincing themselves that Huck's pap probably got smallpox. And he even gets $20 apiece from the two. Like in the scene with the ferryman, before when he tries to send succor to the gang that likely killed his father. And in the scene with Mrs. Loftus. Huck's performances are a kind of linguistic jujutsu, using the narrative that's thrown at him to his and Jim's, always also and Jim's, advantage. By contrast, when Huck's forced to go along with somebody else's fraudulent narrative, he makes a mess of it. As in the altercation with Joanna, the hare lip of the Wilkes family, when he's constantly forced to wiggle out of one inconsistency of a story after the other, and he only escapes because of the positive side of Southern hospitality. The Wilkes girls' determination to believe and befriend this strange boy. The storyline, the story frame here being provided by the king and the duke. Similarly, his attempts at passing for English draws a telling commentary from the lawyer of the Wilkes family. That's the one here on the slide. I reckon you ain't used to lying. Doesn't seem to come handy. What you want is practice. From a lawyer. That's a verdict. The difference between the Huck and the Tom tale formats also becomes obvious from the distance between the two prison escape stories in the novel. Huck's liberation from the supervision by the widow and Mrs. Watson, together with his father, turns into a life-threatening form of imprisonment as the old man drinks himself into delirium. In an often overlooked turn, Huck's waiting behind a loaded gun for his unconscious father to stir again, ready to actually shoot the man, is the closest Huck ever gets to doing anybody premeditated bodily harm. A situation he only escapes by both of them ending up asleep on the cabin floor. So in the next chapter, rather than shooting his father, Huck kills himself, so to speak. The circumspection with which he goes about this irreversible operation is remarkable. Huck is not overly concerned with what his murder might trigger in terms of emotional responses. And it is quite revealing that he thinks of Tom Sawyer as one who would throw in the fancy touches, which is exactly what Tom does when the two try to liberate Jim. Huck's simple plan is too blame simple, there ain't nothing to it. So Tom, in his own warped opinion, has to make it more complicated. The thing is that Tom does not actually think up an escape plan of his own. He relies on what he calls the best authorities, which means that he actually borrows ideas from European books. The best authorities to him are Baron Trenck, Casanova, Benvenuto Cellini, and Henry IV, all of which are 16th to 18th century Europeans whose life stories included imprisonment and, in the cases of Cellini, Giacomo Casanova and Henri de Navarre escapes. His second-hand fantasies, are in a way the exact opposite of this novel. Bad copies of European product lines had been the bane of American literature and the arts during the 18th and much of the 19th centuries. However, there's more to Tom's dreamscape than his desire to copy foreign models. His plans include the idea at one point to saw Jim's leg off, that is, inflict serious bodily harm just for the sake of following through with his borrowed ideas from European books. For the reader to whom Black Lives Matter, this whole mummery is not so much comical, but increasingly ridiculous and even scary. Jim, at this point, has no means to stage his own escape, has no agency. Besides, he knows the boys are at it, and he has no chance but to rely on their goodwill and good reason, which he has all reasons to doubt, given the fancy touches that Tom keeps throwing in, including snakes made up to, right, I had that already. This is the possibilities that this can be read as. The made-up snakes, I like them. Tying buttons to the tails of snakes so they look more like rattlesnakes. I mean, that's, yeah. Just to think up something like that, yeah? And all the way to the actual escape in which all three of them run a considerable risk to get shot and even killed. I mean, Tom has managed to provide his own posse comitatus following them, and these men are armed and ready to shoot and kill. One might see this part of the text just as a burlesque, or as a grotesquely contorted pastiche of actual hunts for escaped slaves. There is, as stated above, evidence that the early audience read this part of the novel as such, and Twain himself used parts of it in his public lectures, and to a lot of acclaim and a lot of laughter. Yet it's also the part of the text that has attracted the most criticism, with critics like Leo Marx and James Cox taking issue with the previous rather perfunctory and evasive approvals of the ending by, for instance, T.S. Eliot and Lionel Trilling. Robert Reagan, no relation to the other Reagan, noted that already in his insistence on pretending that a Sunday school picnic is a caravan of Arabs with elephants, Tom appears, quote, only a little less than insane, having apparently misread his Cervantes entirely. And it was Judith Fetterley who completely deconstructed the figure of Tom in 1972, exposing his deludedness, his petty tyranny, his hypocrisy and cruelty. So it should not come as a surprise that Tom gets a bullet in the calf of the leg, as one predictable result of staging their own pursuit as melodrama with unwitting actors, and that he then is actually the gladdest of them all. If there's no other indication, or if there were no other indication as to Tom's mental status, this would be enough. Given the state of medicine in the antebellum South, the fact that this is not a piece of buckshot or something like that, but an actual lead ball, yeah? And given the amount of destruction that a bullet of the standard 45 to 69 caliber muzzle loader musket ball would wreak on flesh and bones, Tom's reaction can only be diagnosed as medical insanity. Up here you see what a musket ball, which somebody survived actually, does to the upper femur and I'll hand you this, I'll give you this thing. This is an original. This is from an American Civil War battlefield. You get hit by that, it hits a bone, it smashes so much of the bone into smithereens that it's probably impossible to this day to repair that properly, and it definitely was in the 1840s, so that limb would have had to come off. Here. Ironically, Twain has Huck say the decisive thing about it, when he tells the kindly old doctor treating them that Tom had a dream and it shot him. That's a brilliant sentence. Tellingly enough, the doctor thinks that Tom is raving when he hears him continue in his fantastic mode. The end of it all, the ultimate revealing moment when Tom finally admits to his rapt audience that the late Miss Watson emancipated Jim in her will, is only saved from complete character annihilation by the dea ex machina that Twain pulls out of his hat. Aunt Sally says, "Then what on earth did you want to set him free for, seeing he was already free?" Well, that is a question, I must say, and just like women. Why, I wanted the adventure of it, and I'd have waded neck deep in blood to, goodness Lord, I've gone Polly. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer have taken a decidedly ugly turn here. In his takeover of the life of a freedman and the indulgence of gratuitous cruelty for his own amusement, Tom is actually a lot closer to the king and the duke than to Huck, with the difference that the two scoundrels are aware of their shabby conmanship. In this respect, Tom more closely resembles the southern aristocrats of the Colonel Sherburne type, who, in cold blood, murders old Boggs. A harmless, maybe bothersome, but harmless old man, even though the victim is unarmed in the presence of his teenage daughter, has actually stopped raising a ruckus and is pleading for his life. He's also close to the idea of honor that the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons expound, as already Daniel Hoffman noticed. The problem with these types, or rather with their description, as with the Tom episodes at the end of the novel in general, is again that all we have is Huck's perspective and the structural unreliability that comes with it, which requires a meta-reading rather than the empathetic or even identificatory reading that a first-person narrative normally and constantly invites. This meta-reading aspect is of importance throughout. On several occasions, Huck does not, or not quite, understand what he is actually observing. This is a moment in the text that appears modern by comparison, going beyond both the realist and the naturalist. Repeatedly, he comments on events and developments that the implied reader is supposed to decode differently, starting with his reaction to the biblical teachings that the widow and her sister are trying to administer to him, which run up against Huck's flat statement that he don't take no stock in dead people, having missed out on the transfer qualities of moral teachings altogether. A case in point highlighting both Huck's general good nature and caring attitude towards others, which tends to camouflage this, and his lack of interpretive keys, is Huck's misreading of the horse-riding artist in the circus visit episode at the end of chapter 22. The episode is actually quite superfluous in terms of the storyline, but Twain uses it to show how Huck manages to misread the same scene twice. First, he's convinced that there is a drunk man from among the audience getting into the ring and onto a horse. Then, when the camouflage comes off and the rider sheds 17 suits standing on the back of what looked like a fairly wild horse, Huck shares the pleasure and astonishment of the audience, but now he believes that the ringmaster was surprised by the event just as he was himself. This can be read as a token of Huck's unsuspecting innocence. Difficult to follow maybe from today's point of view, where you would think that even a 12-year-old who had to grow up homeless and without parental guidance would have developed street savviness way beyond what Twain ascribes to Huck. And also, this is the age of Phineas Taylor Barnum and of practical jokes and confidence games. Besides, the very next episode, starting right after the circus story and before the next chapter begins, is just one such con game, the King's Camelopard, in which the painted old king capers around on stage to much laughter, and the Duke and the King manage to outdo Barnum in skinning a town's paying audience not twice, but even 3 times. The 40-year gap between the story time of 1845-50 and the time of the first printing in 1885 might have rendered this kind of practical joke harmless. Old-timey frontier humor. However, even if Twain seems ready to let the Duke and the King get away with the $465 that they make in this hoist, which is a considerable sum by the standards of the time, the audience's sense of justice demanded that they be punished for their attempted defrauding of the Wilkes girls of their money. So when they try the Royal Nonsuch again further south, and after selling Jim and the raft, the last the reader sees of the King and the Duke is how they are ridden on a rail, tarred and feathered to an uncertain fate. Their bane, ironically, was Jim, who had told Uncle Silas Phelps about this show thing, and he then alerted the neighborhood. Huck's reaction is strange at this point and interesting. He hastens to town to warn the King and the Duke. And when he finds out he's late, he pities them poor pitiful rascals, as he calls them. A sympathetic position that might appear believable maybe from 10 years hindsight, but hardly with the very recent betrayal of Jim and the outrageous con scheme against the Wilkes girls fresh in mind. Which makes it even more difficult to stomach that Huck does not seem to understand how awful Jim's situation is at the hands of his tormentors, i.e. him and Tom, who are piling things up here, snakes, rats, spiders, into the cabin that Jim's imprisoned in, and endanger his life unnecessarily along with their own. It is as if as soon as there is a higher authority, Huck falls into a pattern of subservience. With the King and the Duke, whom he labors and lies for, this eventually makes way for his actions to restore their money to the Wilkes girls. But with Tom, Huck falls back into his admiration for that boy that was respectable and supposedly not mean but kind, a grievous misreading of Tom. Just like Huck misreads the aristocratic bearing and supposed manliness of the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons and the equally murderous Colonel Sherburne. In the Grangerford case, it is his admiring report of the interior decorations of the mansion which makes it clear to the implied reader that he is awed by what he believes is great art. The readers, however, of 1885 and after, find Twain constructing for them an assemblage of ill-matched kitsch and a stuffy atmosphere on a remarkably ill-managed plantation. All these idiots can think of is how to kill their neighbors. That's all they ever worry about. Besides, Buck Grangerford's "Why, where was you raised? Don't you know what a feud is?" anticipates Tom's reaction and Huck's ignorance of how the best authorities organize a prison breakout, only with more lethal consequences for the Grangerford family. The fact that there is a feud in the book, and that Twain, just like many of his southern readers, was familiar with the Darnell Watson feud to the point that his rendition of their warfare in life on the Mississippi has pretty much all of the constitutive elements of the Grangerford Shepardson episode in it, makes it easy to overlook another referential frame. The time structure, 1850, Civil War, 1885, passing through the Civil War, makes this passage, in my opinion, a synecdoche. The war between the Shepherdsons and the Grangerford families, and also the superficial chivalry that they hold on to, echoes the murderous, low-level guerrilla warfare in the border states, which had all of the worst features of the Civil War in Bosnia in the early 1990s. It might have been, this is speculation, that the realization that he was getting close to writing a Civil War book made Twain break off working on the manuscript in 1877 in the middle of this chapter. For many years, people thought that he ended it with the raft being smashed up by the steamboat, and then the second half of the manuscript was found again, and editors realized, no, he had written to this point, halfway through the Shepherdson Grangerford chapter. It's the same year, 1877, when Twain started thematizing his own war experiences in an address on the occasion of a visit by the Boston Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company in Hartford, Connecticut. Combined with observations already voiced by Blair that it does not make sense trying to escape from slavery by going down the Mississippi past the confluence with the Ohio, the impact of the Civil War memories might indeed have been the turning point, to which Twain would only return many years later, when he also wrote his other important Civil War text, The Private History of a Campaign That Failed. Back to back with this chapter, the Grangerford-Shepherson chapter, appeared first in the same Century magazine within a month from The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, and back to back with another Civil War memoir that was eventually collected into the Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, which signals, I would say, its proximity to the so-called war between the states, which in some cases also was a war between and within families. Both texts were actually illustrated by E.W. Campbell, and have a look at the proximity between the pro-secession militia member, here on the left, in The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, and Huck Finn in this illustration to the novel. It does not look like a coincidence to me, and I could go into more detail about that, but I don't have the time for it. I wrote a whole chapter about this in my habilitation many years back. It might also have been a conscious renegotiation of Civil War-related meanings that made Twain perform the hideous mutation on the character of Tom. His actions and reactions to Jim's captivity, which he unnecessarily prolongs and extends into a cruel, heroic game of self-aggrandizement, are reminiscent of Twain's indictment of the effects of reading too much Sir Walter Scott on the part of the Southern elites, which he says in chapter 46 of Life on the Mississippi. And note that the half-sunk steamboat that turns up in Huckleberry Finn is also called the Sir Walter Scott. One possible reading here is that the South elites were intelligent enough to see that they could not continue the enslavement of millions of African Americans forever, but they willfully decided to ignore their own better knowledge. A revealing moment is that Tom, when he realizes that the escape adventure will be working according to his plan, is in high spirits. This quotation here. He said it was the best fun he ever had in his life and the most intellectual. And he said if he, that is Jim, only could see his way to it, we would keep it up all the rest of our lives and leave Jim to our children to get out, for he believed Jim would like it better and better the more he got used to it. Who? At this point, Huck ought to have interfered, knowing full better that Jim has an aim in his life, which is to liberate his wife and children. But he does nothing. Instead, Jim, whom in the scene with the slave hunters just before, in the skiff, Huck identified as his pap, symbolically, that he becomes his father, reverts to being that nigger in his own diction. Twain's Huck either slips all the way back to before his oft-celebrated decision to go to hell and steal Jim out of slavery again, or else he's so much under the Tom's spell and thumb that he does not even notice. Either which way, the generally positive image of Huck as a representative of the autonomy of the individual that critics like Henry Nash Smith drew of Huck's life in the 1950s and 60s cannot be upheld. This is one of the moments where the text reveals its darker naturalist side. Huck is, after all, of Irish descent and the son of Pap Finn. Caricatures of the Irish as not quite human abounded and were still frequent during the period, even in the 1880s, and they were only topped by caricatures of African Americans, even though the discussion whether the Irish were actually white had been solved in their favor. Still, there is a point to be made that even in Twain's days, it was apparently easier to get away with having a declassed Irish boy travel with an African American in so close proximity than with a quality person. From a naturalist point of view, Huck is predestined to stay at the bottom of society. No great intellectual feats are to be expected of him, and no rise to Horatio Algerian middle-class respectability either. His celebrated insight into the humanity of Jim is limited to this one African-American to begin with, and due to the second coming of Tom, it does not last. Leave alone make room for a message transferring its moment and impact to the rest of the African-American population. By the 1880s, there was already enough evidence to see that the old elites were going to play the non-educated lower classes against the free African-Americans in a game of divide ad impera that was going to assure their supremacy for the rest of the 19th and deep into the 20th and unfortunately also the 21st century. So this might very well be one of Twain's covered political commentaries burning with low fuses all over the novel. Which leaves two topics, the character of Jim, and then I'll say briefly something about the role of women in the story. One of the few things, I should have mentioned this one here. The illustration, the difference in the illustrations is also quite telling. Tom Sawyer here looks so much not like the Tom of the original publication of 1876. Yeah, it's quite amazing. One of the few things that, strangely enough, do not seem to have been attempted as an adaptation of the book is to narrate the whole story from the point of view of Jim, of Miss Watson's slave. All we get as readers are samples of direct speech. Given that with Huck's limited point of view narration and Tom's mutation into a minor scale Grangerford, there are already two structurally precarious textual technologies at work, so it should not come as a surprise that Jim does not provide a structurally sound or coherent configuration, or rather actually Twain doesn't. I mean, he wasn't Superman, a literary Superman. He was good, very good in fact, but there are limits. Too often, his parts of the dialogue are foils for what Huck or Tom has to say. Or else Huck simply claims that Jim was satisfied having to be tied up or camouflaged as a sick Arab. No? There's a whole typical two-part minstrel show scene that's actually brilliant. And after the successful escape, Jim agrees that it was planned beautiful and it was done beautiful. and they ain't nobody can get up a plan that's more mixed up and splendid than what that one was, supposedly. Notice that he calls it mixed up rather than coherent and sense-making. There's maybe that. And then, of course, he does not know at this point that Tom's plan included creating his own posse of armed pursuers. However, there are enough moments in the text to establish Jim as the most humane and a truly fatherly figure. Considering his situation, the most pragmatic thing that Jim might have done after meeting Huck on Jackson's Island is to kill the boy, appropriate his gun, canoe, and provisions, and continue his flight to the Free States. Illinois is not that far, and he's rumored to have killed Huck anyway. Instead, following their escape from the island together, which technically speaking Huck might have avoided by telling on Jim and gathering in the reward on his head, he opens up to Huck, believing he has found a friend, a misjudgment, as Huck's reaction shows. Jim talked out loud all the time while I was talking to myself. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go to saving up money and never spend a single cent. And when he got enough, he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived. And then they would both work to buy the two children. And if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. He wouldn't ever had to talk such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. It was according to the old saying, give a nigger an inch and he'll take an ell. Thinks I, this is what comes of my not thinking. Here was this nigger, which I as good as helped us run away, coming right out flat-footed and saying he would steal his children. Children that belonged to a man I didn't even know, a man that hadn't ever done me no harm. The ensuing debate about Huck's conscience has attracted considerably more attention than Jim's determination to fulfill his role as a father and protector of his children, which surfaces several times in the novel. Huck might have noticed, but apparently did not, how Jim gets engaged in the King Solomon part of the minstrel show parody. He himself brings up the topic of the child that was supposed to get cut into halves, insisting that because he supposedly had 5 million children running around the house, one child more or less did not make a difference to him, whereas the father of only 1 or 2 knows how to value them, and he does. Going down river with the king and the duke on board, Huck observes Jim sitting there with his head down betwixt his knees, moaning and mourning to himself, and knows that Jim is miserable because he's away from his family. So at least between this passage here and the next one, he starts attributing more humanity to Jim. I know what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life. And I don't believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for theirs. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moaning and mourning that way nights when he judged I was asleep, and saying, poor little Elizabeth, poor little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I spec I ain't ever going to see you no more. He was a mighty good nigger, Jim was. Actually, if you want to fault me on what I said earlier, this is the one passage where nigger Jim appears, well, but there's a comma in between, yeah? The idea that it might not seem natural to his listeners or readers that an African-American loves his children as much as a white person is the last sign of what Twain himself called Huck's deformed conscience for a while. He has regretted playing stupid pranks. He has humbled himself to a nigger who in turn dared to call him, however indirectly, trash. The story following the above passage, in which Huck manages to admit that Jim was a good nigger but still does not advance him to the status of a person, takes the insight into Jim's humanity one step further. He's not just miserable because his family is absent, but castigating himself because he once, when she was but 4 years old, mistreated his daughter who had lost hearing as a result of scarlet fever. This story indicates a much deeper level of fatherly concern than Huck ever experienced, at least before he met Jim, or that most white readers would have expected from an African American. Not that we ever see a full admittance of human equality here. The best to come out of Huck is that he knowed he was white inside. Which in view of Tom, the king, the duke, Pap, Sherburne, and assorted others borders on the ridiculous. The white Jim not only cares for Huck all along to the best of his abilities, he also gives up his hard-won freedom to save the leg and possibly the life of the very boy who has tormented him unnecessarily for weeks and got shot in the leg as a reward for his self-designed heroic master narrative. The $40 he receives from Tom for being prisoner to us so patient sounds like a mixture of the 30 silver coins that Judas receives, that's Matthew 26, verse 15, for being a traitor, the 40 dirty dollars the king netted for selling Jim out, and they have even been linked to the 40 acres and the mule African-American slaves were supposed to have been promised at the end of the Civil War but never got. With that, as I said, a few words about the women at least. There are very few female figures in the novel, and those there are get only a handful of important scenes or memorable lines. The most important and simultaneously one of the structurally weakest turns in the story is certainly Aunt Polly's appearance in chapter 42, which interrupts and terminates Tom's self-disclosure as the bloodthirsty monster that the boy from the 1876 novel has turned into. There are no mothers in the book, only widows, spinsters, and aunts, and young girls. The older women are easily duped and confused. The girls, notably Sophia Grangerford and Mary Jane Wilkes, confuse Huck and show remarkably bad judgment when it comes to evaluating the danger they are in. At least, however, several of the women in the book provide a counter-discourse of positive emotionality to the bunch of homicidal frauds and maniacs populating the ranks of the book's masculinity. Unfortunately, that does not keep things from getting even worse. Sophia Grangerford's and Harney Shepherdson's assertion of their love and their elopement spells the end for her father and her brothers and several of his family members. The only consolation from this horribly inverted Romeo and Juliet story is that the young couple might be able to aim for a new start elsewhere, and that Huck inadvertently managed to help them get away. A more likely candidate for a positive view, Toni Morrison has pointed out, for even though the Wilkes girls trust the two frauds and Huck, at least their humanity is not questioned, and Mary Jane tears over the sales of the slaves as grief for a family split, she said. It might be more important than has been acknowledged so far that Twain split up, as he does with a lot of important moments, the effects of the sale of the slave family to two instances in successive chapters to indicate the lasting effect it has on Mary Jane Wilkes. Just so not as to let it appear as if the other more average women of the novel were less bigoted and racist than their more overtly cruel men, there is the Douglas household, which for all the widow's humanity towards the motherless child, Huck still keeps slaves and suffers them to be separated from their family. And Aunt Sally Phelps is introduced with a brilliant line that ranks African Americans as non-people when she responds to Huck's story about the explosion of a cylinder head on the steamboat, which did not hurt anybody but killed a nigger. Well, it's lucky because sometimes people too get hurt. Male or female, this is the antebellum South, and Twain never lets the reader forget it. The realism then of Huck Finn is always a realism of perception, as everywhere else. And the realist versus naturalist aspects I list up here again, and as I said, there are some moments in the book that even reach beyond this into modernism. If then this book still somehow seems to disappear gradually from not just students' reading lists, but from general discourse also, and from the canon, we might ask ourselves what's happening here. For one, I said earlier that the versions of the book that are out now, many of them at least, and definitely the films, have made the book appear less cruel, more romantic, and generally focus on the adventure parts and try to save those from oblivion, much like a number of other classics of world literature have been reduced to this children's adventure book format. For instance, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, The Leatherstocking Tales, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Moby Dick. I mean, all of these are books that were important in their time, and but nobody reads in the original any longer. It's mostly children's versions that we get. I tried to read the original, both of the Adventures of Tom Sawyer and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with my children, and the result was interesting. 4 years apart, both of them lapped up the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. All these crazy stories, there's this apparently good grip that Twain got, after all, on the imaginative powers of an 8 to 10-year-old, which was about the age both of my kids were when I read the book to them. As with Huck Finn, about 1/3 through, they started balking. They simply didn't get it. What? Slavery? As in, what do you mean? Somebody owning somebody else and having to escape from that? Huh? No, they didn't want any of that. They refused to hear more. I had to stop reading halfway through. And you know what? I don't think old Sam Clemens of Hannibal would have minded. Thank you. We have some time for questions. That was quite a brick of a presentation, I admit that. So you may have completely read Huckleberry Finn differently when you did. So if there are any questions or comments, I can take them. Where's everybody else anyway? Is it too cold or something and they're all going to watch this tomorrow? If you don't have any questions, I'll go fishing. Yeah.
What exactly makes naturalism unreliable when it's the perception of one person? You know, in the presentation you had like naturalism unreliable. Exactly. Narrative unreliable.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Narrative unreliability in naturalism. Realism still operates. So the question was, what makes naturalism unreliable if there's the perspective of only one person anyway. The difference here is usually that between the omniscient, or what Stanzel called the omniscient perspective in literature, which of course is a fake, it's a construction. There is no such thing as omniscience. But as a textual technology, it signals reliability. It signals that you should be able to trust this perspective, which is not a personal perspective throughout. And okay, already Nathaniel Hawthorne in The Scarlet Letter plays around with that. There's this moment close to the end where all of a sudden the narrative instance says, I don't know what happened, what was exactly visible on the Reverend Dimmelsdale's chest because I wasn't there. And as the reader, you think, what? You know, you can't do this to me. You know, you've been sort of a reliable narrator throughout. I want to know what was visible there. Bah! But then, I mean, you can't do that to a book, obviously. The moment the perspective shifts from this narrative omniscience, a detached narrator, not him or herself part of the story, to that of a figure integrated, more or less, into the tale. So be that a first-person or a third-person narrative instance, the narrative turns unreliable simply because of the limited perspective. You know, the pivot is still there, but the pivot is limited through that viewpoint. And with Huck Finn, the thematization of this limitation is indirect, but it's there. And it's partly through the time structure of the text, and partly, of course, through his limited education and limited insight into what he's seeing. So there's a chronological or chronotopical and a social limitation, which I would then attribute to naturalism rather than to realism. And it anticipates modernist limitations of viewpoint, where the narrator figure often realizes that they don't know what's going on. Typical Raymond Chandler feature, you know, his private eyes, his detectives even. I mean, detectives are supposed to know everything, aren't they? Sherlock Holmes and all that. Dupin in Edgar Allan Poe, but no, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe stumbles through his own stories and has no idea what's happening. Not even by hindsight. So there's that difference. That was it in terms of questions? Okay, then thank you all for coming, and I hope I'll see you again next week. That's going to be Mary Boynton from Strasbourg, or rather Syracuse University, their Strasbourg program, who will be speaking about Henry James, whom I briefly mentioned here, and the French realists. Thank you all. Good night.